In 1984, Jordan Mechner was an undergrad at Yale University, studying psychology. An amateur computer programmer for years, he'd made games for the Apple II just as a hobby. But in his final year at the college, he decided to try and make a commercial product. The game he made was Karateka, a martial arts combat game in which the hero was to rescue his girlfriend from an evil Japanese warlord. Yes, the premise was simple and more than a little far-fetched, but Mechner more than made up for it in the presentation. For the time, the animations were incredibly fluid and lifelike. With sweeping scenery and an epic feel, the title played more like an adventure than just a game. Publisher Broderbund agreed to publish the game, and before long, Mechner's college side project became the #1 selling game in the US. It was a staggering achievement and convinced Mechner to try game development as a career. Little did he know that his Japanese adventure would pale in comparison to his next project, an action-adventure game that would redefine the genre time and again with a hero who never spoke his name. Karateka eventually sold 500,000 copies, a phenomenal accomplishment in the 1980s. Not bad for one guy still working on his degree. Since he had been the lone developer, he didn't have to split his earnings with anybody but his publisher, Broderbund. With no employees, no office space, and no overhead, this meant that Mechner made quite a bit of money. More than enough to take his time with his next project. Mechner began work on the new game in earnest in 1985, just after graduating. Inspiration came from several sources. For one, he wanted to craft an experience that took gamers on an adventure, even more so than Karateka. He wanted to recall old film classics like the Douglas Fairbanks and Errol Flynn adventures, and more recently, Indiana Jones. To do that, he needed a great setting. He eventually settled on the Middle Eastern tones of the 1001 Arabian Nights. Despite the Arabian inspiration, his working title was Prince of Persia. Still, since it was a working title, he had plenty of time to change it. Once again, Mechner wanted to have animations that were more fluid and lifelike than other games on the market. He knew there wasn't a way for a computer to render that kind of motion on its own, so he cheated. Grabbing a camcorder, he made his brother David mess around for him on film, climbing, jumping, and running. Though David wasn't quite the greatest athlete on Earth, the footage was enough for Mechner's purposes. Mechner had learned an old film animation technique called rotoscoping, in which the artist would trace photographic stills onto film frames. Mechner applied the same principle to his game, digitizing individual frames of his brother's movements and then chaining them together in his graphics engine. The result looked light years ahead of the competition, even though the actual process was really pretty simple. Still, saying the game would feel like an adventure and making it so were two separate things. Though he hadn't intended to, Mechner would spend the next 4 years refining his game. It would involve a mix of platforming, puzzles, and combat. Levels would be designed to require precision movements, requiring Mechner to make the controls slick and responsive. Puzzles would be truly brain-twisting, often forcing the player to question standard gaming conventions. Combat would recreate actual sword fights, since the player would have to defend as well as attack. Then, to really make gamers cry, they'd be doing it all on the clock. Once the game began, they would have 60 minutes to finish the game. 60 minutes. No exceptions. Particularly towards the endgame, it really added a sense of tension to the experience. In terms of the story, it didn't fall far from Karateka's tree. The evil vizier will kill the beautiful princess in 1 hour if she doesn't marry him, and it's up to her peasant lover to rescue her. Unfortunately, he's in the dungeon. But the simple setup was complemented by fantastic level design and artwork, not to mention the great musical score, composed by Mechner's dad. All in all, it really did harken back to the swashbuckling adventures of old in a way no game had ever done before. By 1989, the game was finally done. There was only one problem. It was for the Apple II. When Mechner had started in '85, the Apple II was still a common platform, but by the end of the decade, it had largely been replaced by the original Macintosh. Mechner's masterpiece was on the wrong machine, but he was in luck. Broderbund believed in the game so much that they had the game ported to various other systems, including the Macintosh. The Mac version in particular was a sales phenomenon. Players literally could not believe how good the game looked. The time limit was a masterstroke, causing players to play again and again to get the best time. The controls, the puzzles, and the swordplay were unparalleled. Nothing else on the market was like it. Karateka had been an underground sensation with its massive 500,000 units sold. Prince of Persia, the working title never did change, sold 2 million copies. For one guy in the late 80s, this was a windfall. If Karateka had made Mechner financially secure, Prince of Persia set him up for life. Not surprisingly, the title set off a rash of copycats and was later credited with starting an entire genre. Given all of this, Mechner was free to do whatever he wanted. As it turned out, what Mechner wanted to do didn't include games, at least in the near term. His lifelong dream had been to write screenplays for Hollywood, making exactly the kind of swashbuckling movies that had inspired his games. To that end, Mechner went off to film school, and Prince of Persia was put on the shelf. He wouldn't return to the interactive medium for years. In fact, when a Prince of Persia sequel finally got underway, it wasn't under the one-man wonder. Broderbund producer Brian Ehler, who'd overseen the first game from the publisher's end, would be designing the game alongside Sherman Dickman. Mechner, who still owned the rights to the IP, consulted as a creative advisor. With the founder's blessing, the new guys set off to improve on everything the first game did. The game would be larger, feature even more environments, and would pit players against multiple opponents at once. To be more gentle to new players, the countdown clock would not begin until further into the adventure, after they'd at least learned the game's mechanics. While it was still a pretty ridiculous story, this time involving the evil vizier pretending to be the hero, there was at least more of it. The new game featured several cutscenes that even included voiceover.
A stowaway on a merchant ship, known to no one, scorned by all.
All in all, it helped to propel Prince of Persia 2: The Shadow and the Flame into gamers' hearts as a more than worthy follow-up to the beloved original. It didn't end up being the sales phenomenon that the first game had, probably because it just wasn't the surprise the first had been. But it was still a solid performer and proved to Broderbund that the franchise had life in it. That being said, the rest of the 90s would pass by before the Prince would leap again. When he did, he'd be doing so into whole new dimensions. By 1999, 3D games had clearly established themselves as gaming's future. So, when Broderbund's subdivision Red Orb Entertainment took on the role of crafting a new Prince game, they'd be doing it with polygons. It allowed them to take a fresh look at the game and think about how puzzles and platforming might be changed to fit the new environment. Once again, Mechner advised in the development process from start to finish. Unfortunately, and against Mechner's wishes, the game slowly turned into a Tomb Raider clone. To be fair, Tomb Raider was the most successful 3D adventure game on the market, but it made for a much slower-paced game with, worse, a much slower frame rate. The tight controls that defined the franchise now felt loose and sluggish. It didn't help that, even by sacrificing frame rate, the game still looked ugly. As if that wasn't enough, the game was rushed to retail by Mindscape, which was the gaming subdivision of the Learning Company, which had just bought Broderbund, which owned Red Orb, who was making the game. Prince of Persia 3D had no time for testing, which meant that when it released, it was as buggy as a game could be. All around, it was a disaster, and Mechner still cites it as one of the lowest moments of his career. By all indications, Prince of Persia was dead. A 2D landmark, the franchise was just another casualty of the shift to 3D. After the last game's poor performance, toy maker Mattel chose to sell the name away. How did Mattel get involved, you ask? You see, Mattel had just bought the Learning Company, which owned Broderbund, which owned Red Orb, which made... you get the idea. So they sold it all off to an acquisitions firm, who then sold it all off to French publisher Ubisoft. But it gets more confusing, because even though Ubisoft now owned the rights to the name Prince of Persia, the actual IP rights still belonged to Jordan Mechner, the one-man wonder who'd started it all. Mechner would have to approve any new Prince of Persia game that Ubisoft would want to make. But who wanted to work with that old franchise? Tune in next time to see Ubisoft craft a masterpiece.